Welcome, everyone. My name is Molly D'Agostino. I'm the Policy Director for the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program here at UC Davis. I say here, but obviously we're all in our respective homes, sheltering in place, making the most of it. And I just wanted to thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I did want to make a couple of quick announcements. First, of course, many of you know this webinar series is the result of us canceling the Three Revolutions Policy Conference. And I do say cancel and not postpone because we did make the difficult decision to cancel, the 2020 conference. There was no fall dates that worked well, and we were concerned about potential future cancellations. So we decided to continue to do our work on a virtual basis. So who needs a conference, right? We have a lot of virtual options, and we can continue this conversation virtually. So we plan to do a monthly series of webinars, about monthly, until we hold another conference in spring of 2021. So look out for those dates for the 2021 Three Revolutions Policy Conference, which will be being announced soon. But let's turn to today's topic. It's an extremely important one. Today's webinar highlights the climate and equity theme of this past year's Three Revolutions Policy Conference, and our esteemed panel will discuss the process of how to meaningfully incorporate equity into private and public sector transportation innovations. This means, as many of you know, and we discussed in last month's webinar series, the pandemic underscores many transportation inequities. For many people in the US, especially for many low-income people and in many communities of color, accessing jobs, food, and/or healthcare can be challenging and even dangerous. And the pandemic only underscores this and makes it, unfortunately, more so. So we have work to do as folks interested in transportation issues, and many of you who are listening are transportation experts, policymakers, practitioners. We all have a role to play here in helping to improve transportation equity. And the three revolutions, sharing, electrification, and automation, each have massive equity implications. Today's goal is not to discuss each revolution, to go through sharing, electrification, and automation, but rather to think about mobility innovations and focus on the process. So each of you can take the lessons we discussed today to your work and apply it to your practice. So that's the goal here of our work and our effort here, while we bring to you here for the next hour. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists, who are going to do their best to open your eyes to some of the ways that you can affect change in your work and in your communities. So our first panelist is Hana Creger, a program manager on environmental equity at the Greenlining Institute. The Greenlining Institute was founded in 1993 and is a policy research, organizing, and leadership institute working on racial and economic justice. Hana Creger was the lead author of a paper that is near and dear to my heart because it covered the three revolutions explicitly. The paper was titled Autonomous Vehicle, Heaven or Hell, Creating a Transportation Revolution That Benefits All. So please do take a look at that. It was published last year, and it's still really relevant. Although, of course, we'll discuss today and how things have changed as a result of our current public health crisis. She's also lead author of the Mobility Equity Framework, a tool that can be used to maximize equity outcomes and community engagement in transportation planning and decision-making. And today, she'll discuss a more recent publication and a fantastic resource. It's a toolkit for incorporating equity into mobility pilots. Our next speaker after Hana is Bernadette Austin, who directs the UC Davis Center for Regional Change. Bernadette really walks the walk. She is also a commissioner and former chair of the West Sacramento Planning Commission. So she doesn't just talk about regional change at the academic level, she really does do the work. She also importantly is leading in connecting academia to communities by leading the Transportation Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Group, which is an advisory body dedicated to providing feedback on research led by UC Davis for the Strategic Growth Commission. She holds a master's degree in science and community development from UC Davis. We always like to point out the UC Davis graduates in our events. And certainly not least, our third speaker is Cynthia Cortez. And she's the Associate Director of the Southeast LA Collaborative, SELA, which is a network of nonprofit agencies working collectively to strengthen the Southeast Los Angeles communities to drive regional systemic change. She is also a UC alum, not of UC Davis, alum of UCLA with a master's in social research methodology and an emphasis on evolutional theory. And she also has a BA from UC Berkeley in peace and conflict studies in education. So we've got all the UCs represented. We've got Sacramento, the Bay Area, and LA represented. So this is a very California forward group of people, and we're so thrilled to have all of you with us. So I've taken too long, and I will turn it over to Hana Creger. Thank you so much, Hana, and please do share your screen so we can get started with your presentation.
All right, hi everyone. Just pulling up my screen here. All right, so thanks so much for having me here today. I'm Hana Creger, and I'm a program manager at the Greenlining Institute, and I lead our mobility equity work. So today I'll talk about two things. First, I'll spend some time unpacking race, equity, and why these things should influence how we think and act on mobility issues. And then second, I'll share some specific actions that you all can take to make equity a reality in your work. So for those who are not familiar, Greenlining is a research and public policy nonprofit that has been advocating for racial equity and economic justice for 27 years, with the goal of bringing opportunities and a better quality of life to low-income communities of color. But I think it's always important to start at the beginning and talk about why Greenlining and our partners even have to do this racial equity work. So redlining, which is what's represented on this map, was the institutionalized and systematic practice of government working with realtors and banks to segregate communities of color into undesirable areas and draw red lines around them and deny them loans to buy homes or open businesses. So these red areas on their map were literally coded as hazardous out of the racist perception that it was too risky to lend money there. And so let's take a look at how this actually played out. So this is an audit from the city of Oakland in 1937. This is obviously very offensive language, and it explicitly names, quote, the infiltration of Negroes and Orientals as a detrimental influence on this community and the reason for its redlining. And redlining was instituted all over the US. From 1932 to 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion worth of loans. More than 98% of those loans went to white families. And so at a time when white Americans were amassing intergenerational wealth to buy homes, start businesses, and fund their children's education, people of color were effectively locked out of those same opportunities, which is why we still have a growing racial wealth gap today. And these practices heavily influence transportation. Redlining maps then kind of became the blueprints for where highways were constructed, often directly through communities of color, which not only destroyed local neighborhood economies, but it locked in air pollution and detrimental health impacts that we still feel today. So for example, the map on the right shows the communities today that suffer from the highest socioeconomic and pollution burdens. And you'll see that the red and orange communities on the map of the right are the exact same communities that were redlined 80 plus years ago, seen on the map on the left. So clearly not much has changed, right? And then in addition to air pollution, people of color suffer from higher rates of pedestrian fatalities, as you can see here in this graph. The poorer a neighborhood is, the less likely it is to have safe sidewalks and lighting. And this is largely a result of who is at the transportation decision-making table. And the fact that top transportation decision makers in the US are primarily wealthy, white, able-bodied men, and clearly don't accurately represent the demographics of the communities that they make decisions for. And then additionally, these transportation disparities are also really influenced by which citizens have the time, ability, access, and privilege to show up at those public meetings and advocate for their needs. And so when we talk about equity, we have to talk about power and fair representation. And all of these transportation disparities are nothing new. They were born from America's long legacy of explicitly racist public policies. Because, since the founding of this country on the genocide of Native people, to slavery, to Jim Crow segregation laws, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to Japanese internment, and even to the immigration policies today, race has always determined the winners and the losers in America. And this history was not created by just a few bad actors, right? I mean, these were all deliberate public policy decisions carried out by federal, state, and local government institutions. But, government created these injustices in the past, but governments today can play an important and an essential role in solving them by being champions of equity. Because we know that every single policy, program, budget, and elected official is an opportunity to break this cycle of injustice. And it's a huge endeavor. And that's why government needs the partnership of advocates, academics, communities, and companies who are represented here today. But because we live in an inherently unjust capitalist society, it's no surprise that when it comes to new mobility services, marginalized folks often face barriers to accessing these services if they don't have a smartphone, a bank account, if they don't speak English, or if the service isn't available in their neighborhood because it's not deemed profitable. And so what we're seeing are just more and more technological Band-Aid solutions for a broken and unjust transportation system, which only reinforces and deepens those injustices. And so, the real solution to our transportation problems is not any one technological fix. It's really a total systems change, which means leading with equity and reimagining how we center communities in transportation planning and decision making. And so just one element of that systems change is embedding equity from the very beginning. And so I like this image because I think it shows best the difference between equality and equity. So, equity or equality is the assumption that the playing field is level, and therefore everyone receives the same one-size-fits-all solution. But the image of equity shows that solutions are tailored to meet the various needs of different groups, because people are starting from different places because of systemic injustices like redlining. And then, beyond this image, Greenlining's perspective is that, equity is also about transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and the systems that disproportionately harm oppressed groups of people. And equity is also about increasing access to power. It's about redistributing resources, eliminating barriers to opportunity, and empowering marginalized communities. But there's a lot of good news out there. Times are changing, and cities are definitely raising the bar on equity and have new standards for mobility services. And as a result, some mobility companies like Lyft and Lime, for example, have equity programs within their services. And so it's becoming clear that equity is becoming mainstream, which is a good thing for the most part. Because as equity becomes mainstream, there is a risk that it can turn into an empty promise if there's not a strategy to achieve that promise. And so, equity, it's not a commitment, it's not a promise, it's a practice. And our Greenlining team has developed an actionable 4-step roadmap on how do you stay accountable to turning equity into a reality. And so we also have a toolkit on our website under this same title. So within any mobility project, plan, or program, equity must be embedded in the goals, vision, and values, the process, the outcomes, and the measurement and analysis. And I'll dive into each step right now. So, equity can't just be a talking point in your pilot. It has to be the starting point. And it has to be very explicit within the goals and the mission of the service. And so I want to uplift a really great example of this, which is California's new Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, or STEP for short. So their equity mission is super clear, which is to increase transportation equity in disadvantaged and low-income communities. It's simple, doesn't have to be very complicated, but it's very clearly there, right? So in the second step, equity must be built into the process of how your pilot is developed and deployed. So an equitable process obviously is very complex and it includes a few different steps, but this first must begin with the community identifying their mobility needs. And I want to lift up a great example, the Mobility Hubs at Affordable Housing Sites pilot, which is led by Transform. So Transform has just done an incredible job at developing an equitable process that begins with the mobility needs assessment and allows the residents to guide the program design. Next within the process is an equity analysis to assess the equity outcomes of your mobility service. Now, I want to be clear, there's not like one standardized equity analysis, there's not one single set of equity indicators. Instead, your community must be involved in selecting the appropriate equity indicators and metrics that are relevant to them. And so, here we do have 12 equity indicators, but it's really intended as a starting point. Ideally, the community identifies additional equity indicators and metrics that aren't even listed here, because they know best. And I do want to dive a bit deeper into the economic opportunities indicators in the orange on the far right, because it's often not the primary focus of mobility services. But in addition to mobility services just connecting people to their jobs, mobility services must be providing high quality jobs with fair labor practices and partnering with workforce development organizations and contracting with businesses that are local, women, and minority owned. And I want to share a quick example of where this was done. So San Francisco CTA funded a process where the residents of a disadvantaged community were paid to brainstorm solutions that would meet their needs. And then the residents' list of project ideas were then put through an equity analysis that reflected their needs and values. So the final aspect of building equity into the process is to implement some degree of community decision-making around how a mobility service is designed and deployed. And so picking up at the San Francisco example, the residents voted on which mobility options to fund and deploy. And another example is Austin's bike share program, which asked the community to vote on where best to locate the bike docks and what color the bike should be. And so, involving communities in decision-making, I can't stress this enough. This will make your mobility service more successful in the long run. It will raise awareness. It will give folks ownership over the service. And then the next step is ensuring that the implementation of the mobility service actually leads to equitable outcomes. So for example, your mobility pilot has to be financially, technologically, physically, and culturally accessible to all residents, regardless of their race, gender, income, ability, age, or zip code. The fourth and final step involves regularly evaluating the equity successes and problems of a mobility service in order to continuously improve the outcomes and address those challenges. And so this means involving communities in that evaluation process, in the equity metric selection, and in the data collection and review. And so here I want to uplift an exciting new project by CARB and the University of California researchers who are developing a metrics and evaluation methodology for clean mobility equity pilots. So, whether you're a city, a community, or a company, and for whatever mobility technology or project plan that you're developing, these 4 steps can help to serve as a roadmap for ensuring meaningful, equitable outcomes, not just commitments. And again, we have the complete and detailed toolkit on our website under the same title. And so, equity does take time and dedication, but it is well worth the effort. And I just want to end with saying that, while some people may say, oh, equity sounds really nice, but all that community engagement sounds expensive and it kind of slows us down in reaching the clean transportation future that we desperately need. but it doesn't. And in fact, we're not going to reach our climate goals if equity is not baked in from the very beginning. And this will allow everyone to access a clean transportation future, not just those who can afford it, right? And if we fail to put equity at the center of this new mobility revolution, this will only create new problems and new injustices that we will have to face. And so we have to get this right. I just want to be clear, equity, it's not an obstacle to progress and innovation. It's the foundation. And equity is what will make us stronger and more resilient, especially in face of our current crisis. And so thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the conversation with the rest of the panelists.
Great, thank you so much, Hana. Excuse me. I've done so well. That presentation was really illuminating, and I really appreciate it. And I really appreciated you speaking to this fact that equity is not a promise, it's a practice, right? So turning to Bernadette, Director Bernadette Austin, Director of the UC Center for Regional Change, will give some remarks on both Hana's presentation and her work in Sacramento and broader. So please, Bernadette, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I was really excited to see your presentation. So thank you, Hana. So I wanted to provide a couple of remarks about a couple things. I wanted to talk both with my university researcher hat on and also as a community member. So I'll start with, we are in interesting times. I'm sure that you're probably getting tired of hearing this. We're going on what, week 7, week 8, I'm losing count of shelter in place and responding to the coronavirus. But we really need to think about equity in a time of COVID-19. One thing that I've been talking about with quite a few colleagues is there is going to be another disaster. We were talking about fires before this and floods before that. We are entering into an economic disaster. And so really thinking through, we have to think really long term. And one really important thing that those of us who are participating in today's meeting can take home is to really think about how to plan long term. We need to think about how this rebuilding following fires, floods, pandemics, huge economic downturns can sometimes take a generation. And this is particularly the case in those communities that face the greatest disadvantage. And something that's really important for us to bear in mind is that these community partners are going to be incredibly important in the rebuilding process, and that trust is hard fought but easily lost. So really think about that. One thing that I want to talk about a little bit later in my remarks is to provide a couple of examples of how we at my center, which includes faculty, staff, and student researchers, have built up relationships over time, and in some cases over a decade or more of working with community partners. When you build that trust, you then have something to fall back on when the critical work needs to happen, whether it's planning, research, implementation, evaluation. You have those trusted relationships that you can be in dialogue and collaborate on solutions. So let's see, one thing I also want to mention around that is that relationships with these community brokers, they can be civic leaders, community leaders, they can be service organizations, nonprofits, they can look a number of different ways, but these relationships ultimately can pay dividends. So when you invest in these relationships, then you are able to benefit from some of the wisdom from these communities, whether they're, again, civic leaders, community leaders, et cetera. And then the last thing I want to say about equity in the time of COVID-19 is there can be a sense of pitting the economy versus the environment where only one can win. And I want to underscore that that's not accurate. It's a false dichotomy, and it's also incredibly problematic. It is possible for us to have a successful economy and address our environmental issues. And I'll throw equity into that discussion as well. But these are sort of 3 legs to a table that really provide stability rather than things that need to compete against one another. So I'll provide a couple of examples of research partnerships and then talk a little bit with my community hat on. So one example I'll provide is, interestingly enough, the other two panelists today are part of a Transportation Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Group. The acronym is TJAG. I'm going to put a link in the chat box. It just shows you some of the folks who have been helping review and advise some research, and we are really just at the beginning of this. We're really hoping that this can help inform and shape the methodology moving forward on a number of transportation equity projects. So we are working on several across the state in partnership with other research partners, other research institutions, and we actually are moving into another phase, really looking at some carbon neutrality projects. So I'm excited to see how this work moves forward. But what I wanted to highlight is we didn't actually just start throwing information at folks and say, hey, we need to get your feedback on this, this, and this. We've spent a lot of time listening to understand what these community partners are facing, what the power structures and the decision-making structures look like, so that we can better understand how to address equity imbalances within their communities and their respective industries or sectors. As we've moved forward, now the real work begins, right? And here we are in the time of COVID-19. However, because we've done work in person, we have done work to listen, we've done a lot of the things that need to happen, we can then continue to move forward in this virtual world. So that's really important. I want to shift focus to a new project that we're going to be working on over the next couple of years, working on how communities have been impacted by the high cost of living in the Bay Area. Many of those workers, typically service workers, wage workers, the hourly workers, are being forced out into lower cost areas, including the Central Valley, that's California Central Valley. There's a couple of implications for that. One is they, in effect, have been displaced by the high housing costs, and now the large influx of people coming into this community may also be contributing to displacement of the folks who have been living in these Central Valley communities. So you have a two-tier issue of potentially displacement and gentrification. You also have pretty significant transportation implications for that as well. So when people are driving in their cars for 4 hours a day, that's really significant. So we see this in the Bay Area, we see this in Southern California, we're increasingly seeing it in other communities around the state and around the country. And so we really need to look at what's going on here in these mega regions based on a single economy. So we're excited to roll that project out. We're just starting, and here we are in a time of COVID-19. So what are we doing? Well, thankfully, our faculty, staff, and student researchers have built up trusted relationships over time with these partners who we're going to talk to. That can include local metropolitan transportation planning organizations. That can include city council members. It can also include health social service providers. It can include youth development specialists. It can include educators. So a large range of people who can provide some really important insights into what the impacts of this work are. We may not be able to gather people in person for a more traditional kind of focus group. It may be challenging to get people to participate in these Zoom settings. But if we've established these relationships, we now have an opportunity to really do the work because we've put in the effort to build trust. And I will say a couple things about building that trust. How do you build trust? Again, going back, we listened. We included them in forming the methodology. They helped us shape what the questions we wanted to ask, and they helped inform how we wanted to message the research findings. So 2 examples of that were, we've done quite a bit looking at youth and family health in the Central Valley, and we've also done quite a bit of work on water justice. And our work can help support their work. So when you listen and you understand what their priorities are, then you can then support them in those efforts. So those are a couple of examples that we have going on at the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis. And then I'll spend the last couple of minutes pivoting to another role that I play. So I'm seen by some as a civic and community leader in the community that I live in. I live in the city of West Sacramento. And as a community volunteer and advocate, my kids go to school with these folks' kids. We go to the same grocery stores. We are walking and biking on the same streets. And so there's not just the professional experience, but the lived experience. And so one of the roles that I play in my city is I'm on our planning commission, and we are making land use decisions. So by some definitions, I would be one of the decision makers for my community. what I'll highlight too is my community, not unlike the communities that you may live and work in. We have haves and we have have-nots. We have some of the most uh, deepest red disadvantaged communities, according to CalEnviroscreen, and I'll provide a link to that in the chat box. So that's a state designation looking at both environmental and social data. And so just keeping in mind that we face a lot of things in my community. And again, many of the communities live and work in may face similar issues. So one thing I want to bring to folks is things to think about when you are in a decision-making role. So the first is, how do you do community engagement during these unusual times? One thing that there's many things to discuss, but one thing I want to talk about is bridging the digital divide. So what's positive is that our youth are at the forefront of this digital divide. School districts, particularly ones with the most resource-poor communities, have had to address solutions of how we're going to get Wi-Fi to homes, how we're going to get technological devices enough to distribute amongst the different youth and families within our school district. So already school districts have been on the front lines of bridging that digital divide, and it hasn't been perfect, but there may be some great solutions for us as decision makers on resources, pathways, et cetera, for us to keep in mind. I'll also point out that the Center for Regional Change is working with some of our partners, both in the transportation side and also on food access and food security side, to curate a set of resources that are already out there to help both community leaders as well as decision makers figure out how to do this community engagement in a very unusual time. Another thing I'll talk about is this new normal that everyone's talking about. In my mind, this new normal offers a lot of opportunities for us to improve. So I've talked with some of my colleagues, some fellow planning commissioners from across the state through an American Planning Association California chapter seminar last week. And it was very interesting to hear some folks have found that they're having a significantly increased participation because of this new opportunity. We can live stream, we can use social media. And even if that was available before, people are much more aware and it's much more accessible now because everything is moving to a digital platform. So I did talk about the problems of the digital divide, but on the other side, people who are comfortable with social media, who can now watch this streaming in a social media setting, it may be much more accessible to participate in public hearings and public processes. So that feels like a good opportunity. The other thing I think about is the opportunity to reduce the barriers to public participation. So childcare, if you can stream from home, participate from home, childcare is a non-issue, a very different issue. If you have sensory impairments, you may be able to have the narration available to you in this new digital setting. And also language may be a barrier. And a colleague pointed out an example of how one jurisdiction was using Bang the Table to do some real-time translation. So all of these are great examples of how it's not always about while we do need to identify what some of the barriers are, there's some really great opportunities to address community engagement in this new normal. I do want to also plant the seed for us to think about the inequities that are being posed by the reopening of the economy. So we're hearing a lot about this. A lot of states have already reopened. Counties in California are reopening according to kind of a phased reopening as well. However, real issues, we face real issues in addressing the reopening of the economy, particularly when you look through a social equity lens. And so something that's near and dear to my heart is the childcare obstacles. So as we have reopening of economy for people who are service workers, hourly workers, working in retail, service, and hospitality, you have a disproportionate number of people who are parents and maybe parents of young children and may have very few or limited opportunities on childcare just because there just isn't much childcare available. And schools will be closed not just for the summer, but potentially not reopen to the full extent in the fall. I also think about the economic hardship that is facing our communities. So when I look at folks who look at communities through the Great Recession, when you talk to low-income neighborhoods and you talk to community representatives from communities of color, they will say, we haven't even, or we are just recovering from the Great Recession, which happened over a decade ago. And we really need to think about that. And related, we need to think about what the transit services that are available. One thing that in many communities, we are cutting transit service. Another thing that's concerning too is we had an amazing explosion of micro-mobility, and micro-transit in our communities, but have those been cut? So have there been cuts to public transit? Have there been cuts to micro-mobility and micro-transit? And we need to be aware that people are reliant on those to return to work. So although ridership and usership may have gone down, there may be a return to we may not return to the full levels, but we're going to see more clientele from what we've seen over the last 6+ weeks. And then the last thing I want to highlight are some opportunities for those of us on the call. So speaking to local and regional governments, there's an opportunity, to Hana's point, about baking equity into your planning processes. So not only do you need to look at your community engagement aspects, but as you work on your general plans, including your environmental justice element in California, your climate action plans, and your sustainable community strategies, is equity a key focal point for that work? If you need guidance, there are folks who can help you. There is technical assistance available to you. So don't let it be something that is overwhelming. It's better to bring people along in the process and ask for help because the resources are available. Also, there's so many opportunities now, again, because we are digital, to do community engagement in a way that we haven't been able to before. Then I look at state agencies, again, to underscore that there's an opportunity to include community engagement funding and processes into your state-funded projects. Great examples of that. I would turn to, for example, the Cal EPA's Environmental Justice Unit. They've done some really excellent work, Strategic Growth Council. So many organizations and many state agencies already have some models for you to turn to. So again, you do not need to recreate the wheel. And last but not least, when I look at the private sector, there's a number of things that we can talk about. But again, I kind of want to just get back to the fundamentals. Do your employees, your clients, and your customers have the access to things like mobility to patronize your work, to be able to safely return to work, to be able to utilize your services, to purchase your goods? So just thinking about that in sort of a macroeconomic perspective is something important to consider. And with that, I'll turn it back to Molly.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. That was really interesting. I really, really appreciated this. I mean, I think we all can appreciate that, there's a false dichotomy or false dilemma between equity, environment, and the economy. And I think that, that is definitely something that has rung true with our discussions. So we can continue talking about that after. So Cynthia will take us home and give some introductory remarks, and then we will come back with some question answers, both from, I have a couple questions I'll ask the panel, and we'll turn it to the audience questions. So Cynthia, the Associate Director of SELA, will now present to us some findings and thoughts on this topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Hana. Thank you, Bernadette, for laying down the foundation to have this conversation. I'm going to be pulling from the equity discussion that Hana presented today. I'll be pulling in from the community engagement perspective that Bernadette's bringing to the table, and really highlight and illustrate the work that's been done on transportation in the Southeast LA community. So before talking a little bit about the research studies and what we understand and how we're talking about mobility in the region, it's important for me to set some context so that when we interpret the work that's been done, it's really situated on community voice and engagement. So before I get started, I want to say thank you to the SELA Collaborative, our 12 members, and our growing community who have been constantly vested in uplifting community needs informed by community voice. I want to say thank you to the residents who are forthcoming with kind of explaining what their daily experience is with the bus system, with the new rail line coming to the community, understanding what are different modes of moving around the region and what's important to them, particularly now under COVID. I want to say thank you to the USC research team who have served as great partners with us, thinking about the role, research, and the scope of work for those research projects, how they interweave with the work that we do on the ground with focus groups, and getting that community input to pivot and respond and think thoughtfully about how do we consider what's being brought to our table given the type of understandings we're already developing in our research work. and overall the knowledge and expertise in the region. Because without these studies that have been happening for years, it'd be difficult to situate ourselves now. So a shout out to organizations like Eastern Communities for Environmental Justice, who continue to bubble up what these issues are like from a resident perspective, from a leadership perspective, and all of those conversations have been conversations we've been having collectively, not only with residents and CBOs, but with our city partners, elected offices, and people who are vested in this work. So I just wanted to get that out in the world. So about the Southeast. Southeast LA is part of LA County. And this particular part of LA County is a working class community, low income, immigrant, Latino predominant community. We're a bilingual community. We're a community who has many freeway systems running through it, from the 710 to the 5 to the 105, moving a lot of goods from the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles, not only through the Southeast, but all over the nation. So air quality in the history is one of the worst in LA counties and arguably the nation. There's a lot of richness though in the region, and we've learned that through different research studies that I'll mention in brief. But the way we as a collaborative came together was in response to city corruption scandal in one of our cities, where a group of nonprofit leaders who are directly serving residents and providing important needs across different issue areas came together and say, how do we work on regional connectivity? Because there's already a sense of, if we're going to resolve any one particular issue, housing, economic, workforce development, it's going to take this collective of different stakeholders. And that's going to be important as I kind of share through the work that we're doing in regards to transportation. And we have 3 strategic priorities. They include civic engagement, hence why we're able to have that network with our residents and SELA leaders to kind of talk about what are the issues that matter most in the community. Nonprofit capacity from the perspective of operations. If we're going to have these community-based institutions that are the trusted messengers, how do we support their livelihood through things like COVID-19 and make sure that these entities are still around to bridge that community engagement strategy? And our last area is research. A lot of our conversations are grounded in what we learn from research methodologies, from what we hear from community, and just the casual conversations of what does it mean to uplift the region. So to talk about the work that we're doing in partnership with Strategic Growth Council, I'm going to take you back to a couple of pivotal milestones that led us to why this conversation is possible today. And our first study in the region, as Leon shared in our link, I want to highlight the work done by one of our members called Pat Brown Institute at Cal State LA. And they led a research study on the 710 corridor, an asset-based research study that kind of highlighted the SELA communities and what were the assets in there, moving away from this deficit perspective of have-nots, but really thinking, what is the infrastructure of this community? What can we tap into? Who are the players involved? What are some things that we can think about as we're moving through our planning and the way we want to uplift the region, knowing that there's a lot of unmet needs? So we have this asset-based reports that elevates that. After that, we were able to carry out, again, Pat Brown Institute took the lead on the SELA transportation, critical choices on transportation explicitly. So we're looking at the connection between housing and transportation, safety, pedestrian, bike infrastructure, but also the flow of heavy duty trucks and public transit, not only from affordability and ability to access jobs through it, but thinking about the quality of it, like frequency and on-time performance, and thinking about things like this, which help us yield our policy and advocacy agenda, which speaks to transportation as an explicit issue area, highlighting things like collaborations with different stakeholders. This includes cities, CBOs, the COG of Gateway City COG particularly, Metro in LA, Caltrans, and also groups like the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, who have vested interest in electric clean vehicles, right? So when we're thinking about what are the issues in the Southeast, we know that air quality is important, moving around at a cost affordable way is important, thinking about who are the direct users and where they're going. Are they going to the grocery store? Are they traveling into downtown? What are those patterns? We don't necessarily know that until we talk to community. And we're talking to community bilingually. We have Spanish interpretation. We book the times during days of the week and time slots that are accessible to our families. And it looks different for different organizations. I know one organization in the Southeast, Best Start SELA, they actually work with ride-hailing services. I'm trying to use the correct terminology here, because our parents may not go to the meeting if they don't have access to transportation. So we have a good lay of the land in terms of what are the resources, how do people move around, and things along those lines. which allowed us to continue what we learned in our second research study with critical choices in transportation, which is the work we're doing right now in partnership with USC. It's called the SELA initiative, and there's two branches of it. So one is the impact of heavy duty trucks, and the other one is modes to improve public transit. And one thing I really want to emphasize is how completely interconnected they are. Because as we learned through our first wave of focus groups, which were embedded in this research study, safety became an issue across both fronts. But safety has been made a little bit more complex due to COVID. So if we think about like heavy duty trucks in the region, we're thinking about safety along maybe the freeway corridors and truck car collisions, pedestrian collisions, the infrastructure of the cities that have maybe narrow streets, or like the way crosswalks are laid out, right? So the pedestrian friendliness of safety. If you look at public transit and maybe using the bus systems or the rail lines, it becomes safety on the actual bus or train, but also safety waiting. Is it well lit? Is there emergency call line that I have access to? Things along those lines. With the layer of COVID, it becomes in a public setting like a bus or a train, I'm afraid I might get infected with COVID. And if I'm already from a working class, low income community with different issues connected to me, now we have to think, how do we include these very real realities as we think about what are the right type of services and resources to infuse in this type of community. I'm very grateful that our researcher team, both Dr. Genevieve Giuliano and Marlon Barnett, have been very forthcoming with their research students and saying, okay, how do we partner up with the SELA Collaborative and have those conversations of like, how do we design these focus groups? How do we reference all of the feedback community has given to date? So reflecting and learning and saying, this is what we heard already, so that it doesn't feel like a constant, hey, we have the study, let's pull your perspective here. Hey, we have the study, let's pull your perspective there. And it becomes, no, pause. We've had research study A and B and our policy and adequacy agenda. We have to come back to community and say, this is the ground we've covered and this is where we're at now. So that community always sees their voice as they're moving through. And that's part of the design. When I heard Hana talk about like embedding it into the process, it becomes a practice that we as an organization or research entity must come back to the table with. It's not enough to say, I have a hunch, I got feedback, I have another hunch, give me more feedback. It doesn't work that way, because as a person saying, I'm hearing you saying that my perspective matters and I can create change and my voice is going to influence decision-making, how do you validate and reinforce that that is truly happening? And that's part of the loops that we create along the way. So I'm very, very grateful that our research partners have allowed us to do that. So what I want to highlight here is that, again, in the spirit of understanding transportation in the Southeast, this year we released our Living and Working in SELA survey. And we know that there are many different issues in the Southeast that are important to us. I never strive away from emphasizing we are a multi-issue, interdisciplinary, intersectional way of understanding mobility. And this Living and Working in SELA exemplifies that. It has questions on jobs, it has questions on the census, it has questions on environmental concerns. Really, what are the key topics when you're a resident somewhere? What matters to you? That is represented in the survey. There are a couple of questions on transit that I want to bring to light here. And again, these are being done pre-COVID. So this survey was wrapped up and then COVID hit. So we already know validity might have completely shifted now that we're dealing with COVID. And I'll get to that towards the end of what I'm sharing here. But for example, like SELA, it has been known and saw in different reports that is a car-dependent community, right? There are a high percentage of folks that do use public transit because we are a low-income community and it's accessible to those folks. We do know in talking, having conversations with some of our partners that we have people that are bike, that's their primary mode. And in one of the reports shared by East Yard, in there they outline that in the SELA cities themselves, so if you're thinking about in the neighborhoods and the business districts, we don't have bike lanes. We do have the bike lanes going down the LA River, but what does it mean to think about the infrastructure if we want safer roads and safe ways of commuting that are also low impact on the air quality? Walking is important, biking is important, but if I feel unsafe to do that, how do I talk to the cities, right? So, and then we switch hats with perspective. We're talking to the cities and cities are thinking, well, I need money. What revenue systems do I have? The SELA cities are 8 cities that maybe one of our cities is like a square mile long. They're small corridors. So even if one city puts a bike lane in and 1.5 miles in, you're in another city without the bike lane, it takes a significant amount of regional coordination to think about that. Also in consideration here is if we're thinking about different options, like let's say we want a fleet of some kind of fleet, whether it's a fleet of bus systems or cars or whatever it may be, space in SELA is very, very scarce. There aren't really big open lots. We have a large percentage of factories, warehouses in the region, and our residential hubs, and then our business districts. But when we think about space, and we've had these conversations and understanding, like, where does a bus stop if the bus needs to stop and the bus driver needs water, and just take care of their basic human needs. It becomes this really nuanced way of understanding these conversations and linking them back to what would be the right policies, but who are the right players. And that's why it's important for us to engage the cities, the CBOs, the residents, Metro, Lacey, Caltrans, and these are the folks that are currently sitting on the advisory committee for this particular research study with Strategic Growth Council. So thinking about those factors, also I wanted to bubble up the role of education that plays into these studies. So as we think about, let's say, the new bus study, Metro's Next Gen Bus Study, it includes that component of what are the areas you travel to, where the bus lines run through, but also like educating the community and thinking about, okay, this is how we're thinking about improving public transit. Educating them and saying, this is our distribution of this information, which might be a CBO partnership. But unless you're thinking about that from the design perspective and from concept to execution, it may fall between the cracks, because the educational component is thinking users. How do I engage this community that is car dependent, that do want and have identified different modes of transit, but in a way that kind of highlights what is the match between level of urgency. If it's safer streets for pedestrians, and we have big, heavy and medium duty trucks, and we also know that we want cleaner mobility options, how does that fit into what community has identified they need and what opportunities we have by virtue of different grants or projects or funding options, so that the discussion that happens becomes critical. And then as we boil it up, again, it becomes a sense of, how do we make sure all these perspectives are coming to the table and have clear pathways to decision makers and that inclusion of the different folks? Because again, the more diversity we add to that conversation, the richer that discussion is going to be to identify what is a collective interest here, and how do we find a way that it's not a win-lose, but it's a win-win. And that does take time, because at the end of the day, these projects build upon each other. And that's why it's important to narrate the history and be very thoughtful about it, so that community sees themselves through all of this. So thinking about those pieces, then I want to kind of talk about the work.
Cynthia, we just have about 5 minutes left total. So if you could just, I'm so sorry, but could you wrap up quickly?
Not a problem. I'm going through my notes. I think if there's one to elevate here, is what would be, here's my question to any discussion around this, is like, based off of COVID-19, and we know that we've lost income and jobs have disappeared, and healthcare is an issue, and the digital divide is a real concern, and access to food and just basic necessities from the communities at the forefront. And we're thinking about equity. The question I want to pose is, what does an equitable economic recovery look like then? What does the practice, we hinted at it earlier, what's the practice of equity going to look like if we know this is the new status of our community? And we have currently a post-COVID survey of living and working in SELA underway right now that would help us, give us some clues as to where to look. But as we bring all these pieces together and think about how do we improve mobility, it becomes that conversation as well.
Yes, absolutely. That's quite right. We have a lot of questions remain unanswered. But I actually want to ask you the first question. And also, it's a question that I had, and it also came up someone in the Q&A as well. So I wanted to, Bernadette mentioned some changes in how you do community engagement during the pandemic. What are your thoughts what are some of your biggest lessons learned as a result of the pandemic, and how would you go about doing community engagement during these times?
I think when COVID hit, we were remiss of doing our second round of focus groups in person, similar to the work we did prior. But what we've learned is how critical all of those relationships were to try to get our survey or need for feedback down to the residents in a remote way. I think the hardest piece was kind of saying, I can't talk to in person, we can't do this focus group, but one of the things we did is like, how can we use online technologies to do it? So for our research study on public transit, what we decided to do was create a Survey Monkey. And in our first distribution, we had the Survey Monkey, it was bilingual. We tried to do a distribution through social media, and we talked about it with our members and we shared this information. But what we noticed is that we weren't tracking in response rates. Like our folks weren't completing the survey from that vantage point, right? Because it's easy to say, oh yeah, post it online, people are gonna fill it out. They care about, doesn't work that way when your mind is on survival and food and shelter and childcare. It doesn't work that way. So we huddled with the research team, SELA Collaborative, we huddled and thought about how can we get this out there? And in round 2, we had a bilingual email script that we strategically distributed through our partners that are vested in environmental justice, transportation, or community engagement work. We had a script for WhatsApp in English and Spanish as well with the survey link, and really try to promote it through, hey, this is something we're working on, we're struggling, but can you help support us? So we had 2 trusted voices, one from the SELA Collaborative and one from our distributive CBO partner who got it down to community members. So again, it just highlights, if we're actively sharing and informing and being forthcoming and reminding them, here's your voice, folks will continue to stay as part of that relationship. As soon as it doesn't feel reciprocal or extractive, that would have been even more difficult trying to get responses remotely.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, using WhatsApp is a fantastic example of, just problem solving to meet the needs of the community and meet them where they are. So I want to turn now to new mobility and discuss public transit and new mobility partnerships. So transit agencies, have partnered with new mobility companies. By that I mean, your ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft, or micromobility companies like Lime, or I was about to say Jump, but Jump is now Lime, right? So I wanted to discuss how transit agencies can partner with new mobility companies, and what does that look like now in this new era? So Bernadette, I know you mentioned the microtransit pilot in West Sacramento, and Hana, you've also mentioned an interesting pilot in the Bay Area. So I'd love to turn first to Bernadette to speak to the West Sacramento example of good microtransit partnerships and how those may move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, to answer this as quickly as possible, what I'll mention is that they need to go together. So, for example, my community is at the border of 2 counties, and so our residents regularly use transit services from 2 different counties that necessarily work together. And so that's great. And there's of course room for improvement, but that's wonderful. But also, when you add micromobility in, people don't tend to only use that service. In this case, the company is VIA that operates it in West Sacramento, but to do that first mile, last mile in a much more creative way. So for example, seniors with limited physical mobility, not saying that they all do, but ones that may have mobility issues, can, instead of trying to walk a long distance to the correct transit station or transit center where they need to make their connections, they can then use a microtransit option, similar for students. So that's one example of how it's not just micromobility and microtransit connecting from point A to point B, but then leveraging the transit agencies. And so that could be a tricky thing to navigate, is the private agencies, the public agencies, and in our case, 2 different counties. And as was raised earlier, many of the communities we work with, people may be utilizing more than one transit agency to get where they need to go for services, employment, et cetera.
So Hana, were there examples from the Bay Area that come to mind for you about mobility partnerships with transit agencies or with housing projects?
Sure. So I never miss an opportunity to uplift the work of one of our close allies, Transform, who I mentioned are leading the mobility hubs at affordable housing sites pilot. And so residents at 3 different affordable housing sites are pretty intimately involved in selecting and shaping which mobility options meet their needs, whether that's electric car sharing, bike sharing, scooter sharing, or free transit passes. And I like that this allows for some flexibility. And so as part of an equitable process, Transform partnered with residents to co-develop a very robust mobility needs assessment. They paid residents to take the survey, which was translated in multiple languages, and then asked residents to rank their preference of mobility options based on what met their needs. And so in my mind, this is like the gold standard of what we all should be aspiring towards in terms of needs assessment. Because it's not enough to just introduce a mobility option to a community and then try to mold it to be more equitable. Because at that point, you've already decided the mobility option for them and it may not meet their needs. So, we really want to be moving towards like community self-determination and empowerment models.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we're at time, which is unfortunate because there is so much more to discuss. I feel like I'd like to turn it to each of you just for a really short closing remark. And the question I have for you is: are you optimistic or pessimistic about our transportation future? And you have less than a minute to respond, so I'm sorry. I apologize. This is a tough one to answer in a minute, but and for those of you who ask questions in the Q&A, we'll do our best to answer some of them directly or post some information online about those questions. But turning first, let's start with Bernadette. Do you have optimism or pessimism? You can one-word answer or whatever.
I'm nervous, but I'm hoping that the fact that people can only walk within 15 minutes of, or whatever, 15-minute walk from their house, suddenly where you live really matters. I'm hoping will contribute to some good land use patterns.
That's true. Thank you. Yeah. Cynthia, do you have one way or the other, or are you of both minds?
No, I'm hopeful. I think with COVID, we've learned or strengthened, not learned, but to work with each other more deeply. And I think if we're thinking about how do we do something so essential in our community infrastructure, I'm very much hopeful of expanding and including and diversifying those conversations.
Right. And we'll close with you, Hana. Are you hopeful or concerned?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that equity is really beginning to take root in this current social and political climate. It's not going to go away anytime soon, I hope. And I hope that these equity-focused policies become our new normal. Right.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm kind of not surprised that you're all on the hopeful side. We tend to have, an optimistic tone, and I know these are really trying times. And I won't make light of the huge challenges that community members are facing as they navigate their own transportation choices. And so we certainly are not belittling those choices, but we can come in with some optimism and some hope that we have, a chance to address those changes, those challenges now, and and maybe our new normal can be better than prior to COVID. And let's hope for that, because if we go back to the way it was, it's not good enough. We have work to do to make it even better than going back to prior to COVID. So with that, I'm gonna close. We obviously have more questions around climate change. We could discuss forever. So, but we'll get back to anyone who asks good questions on the Q&A, and we'll post some information on the website. So thank you so much for joining me today. Our next webinar will be in June, and we'll send all of you an invitation to participate in that conversation. Thank you to our panelists today. We really appreciate you joining us, and thank you all for participating. So thank you.